Good afternoon or good morning as appropriate. Welcome to our series, Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy, here at the Institute for International Economic Policy of the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I'm James Foster, Institute Co-Director, and I'm very excited to have with us today Steve Killelea, entrepreneur and philanthropist, founder of the Institute for Economics and Peace, discussing his new book, Peace in the Age of Chaos, the best solution for a sustainable future, which is one man's journey to measure and understand a sustainable world. Thanks, Steve, for being here with us today, and welcome to DC.
My pleasure.
Steve's team developed the Global Peace Index, a multidimensional measure, and accordingly, we are joined by three colleagues who appreciate multidimensional measurement as well. Sabina Alkire, Director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, at Oxford University, who will be moderating today's session. Pedro Conceição, Director of the Human Development Report Office, or HDRO, from the UN, who will be the first discussant. And from GW, our very own Matt Levinger, Director of the National Security Studies Program at the Elliott School, who will be the second discussant. Thank you all for being here today. It's a real pleasure for the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IEP as we call it, to be co-sponsoring this event with Oxford's OPHI and UN's HDRO. Before jumping to my colleague Sunil Sharma, who will describe our series, a few words about our school and our institute. As the largest school of international affairs, the top-ranked Elliott School has a remarkable location, a short stroll from the World Bank, the Treasury, the Fed, and the Fund. IIEP is a research institute within the Elliott School, where scholars and policymakers discuss their newest findings on such topics as global governance, climate change, and multidimensional poverty. For example, last Monday in our multidimensional measurement series, Ricardo Santos of UNU Wider provided a somber assessment of horizontal inequalities in Mozambique, which is experiencing a dramatic uptick in conflict. On Tuesday, Michael Barnett of GW presented his new book revealing the lines of tension between humanitarianism and human rights advocacy. And next Monday, David Stewart and Sola Engelbertsdotter from UNICEF will discuss the policy and advocacy use of multidimensional poverty measures. If you miss an IEP event, you can check us out on our YouTube channel, IIEP GW. Now I'll turn the floor over to Sunil Sharma, distinguished scholar at IIEP and former official at the IMF, to say a few words about the present series and introduce today's moderator. Sunil, the floor is yours.
Thanks, James. Today we have the sixth seminar in the series on rethinking capitalism and democracy. We started this series on rethinking capitalism and democracy during the current COVID-19 pandemic, which, like the global financial crisis a decade ago, has again laid bare the cracks in the leading capitalist democracies. In little more than a decade, we have had two systemic crises. Political polarization in the major democracies has made it difficult for societies to be deliberative and make hard choices. And as the recent crises have shown, the consequences are borne disproportionately by the less fortunate, and the political fallout could make it even harder to face up to future systemic challenges that will undoubtedly arise. We've had a sequence of excellent seminars covering several topics, from valuing nature and biodiversity, to the emerging architecture of global finance, to governing finance for sustainability, to taking stock of climate change, to redesigning financial regulation for the 21st century. Today's seminar, Peace in the Age of Chaos, again addresses a fundamental issue. Without peace, it is hard, if not impossible, to imagine societies creating the trust and cooperation to solve systemic challenges. Yet, how we achieve peace and generate social trust seems elusive and poorly understood. With that, let me introduce our invited moderator today from Oxford University, Dr. Sabina Alkire. She's joining us today from Bhutan, where she is no doubt contributing to to the Gross National Happiness Index. Sabina directs the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, a research center within Oxford's Department of International Development. She and her co-authors, which include my colleague James Foster here at GW, have devised a new multidimensional approach to measuring poverty and well-being that goes beyond the traditional focus on income and growth and includes social goals such as health, education, nutrition, and other aspects that make life worth living. This measure has been quite influential and has been adopted by Bhutan, Mexico, UNDP, the European Commission, the UK's Department for International Development, among others. We are fortunate that Sabina could join us today from Bhutan. Sabina, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much to Sunil, to James for this seminar opportunity. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Steve Killelea. Steve founded the Institute for Economics and Peace, IEP, which is distinct from IIEP, the institution hosting the seminar series, but a lovely synergy. He founded IEP in 2007, and it's an independent global research institute that analyzes intertwined relationships between business, peace, and economic development. For example, they calculate the economic cost of violence. They measure peace using the Global Peace Index, as James mentioned. They do a risk analysis of national threat levels. And they promote positive peace, which is an 8-pillar model embracing the attitudes, institutions, and structures required to sustain peaceful societies. As a global philanthropist, Steve has laid the foundations to develop an entirely new understanding of peace that we will hear about in the presentation today. As a thought leader, he's reshaped the concept because he recognized its integrity to the revival of economic and political systems. As an international entrepreneur, he brings his highly successful career in technology to this problem and shed a new light on issues from terrorism to conflict, because his work, as you'll see, combines strategic views, quantitative matrix, intellectual determination, policy, intuition, and a genuine thoughtfulness for all beings. Steve currently serves on the President's Circle for Club de Madrid, the largest form of democratic former presidents and prime ministers working to strengthen democracy. And he's also honorary president for Religions for Peace, the largest organization in the world working on inter-religious challenges. Steve, the screen is yours. After we'll introduce the discussants. So Pedro Conceição has been director of the Human Development Report Office in the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, since 2019. And under his leadership, 2 of the most substantive human development reports in my mind have been published, one on inequality and one on human development in the age of the Anthropocene. Prior to that, Pedro directed strategic policy at the Bureau for Policy and Program Support of UNDP for 5 years. And the previous 5 years, he was chief economist and head of strategic advisory group at the Regional Bureau for Africa. Matthew Levinger, our second commentator, directs the National Security Studies Program, an executive education program for senior officials, as well as the Masters of International Policy and Practice program at George Washington's Elliott School of International Affairs. Before joining GW, he developed and taught executive education programs on international conflict analysis and prevention at the United States Institute of Peace. Levinger was founding director of the Academy for Genocide Prevention at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, and also taught at other universities and worked as the William C. Foster Fellow at the US Department of State. So we have a real intellectual pioneer as our speaker. We have somebody with a long history of detailed work in economic development and another at education and peace. This is a splendid combination, and we're looking forward to the interchange. Steve, the screen is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction, Sabina. Your words are too kind. So what I'm going to do now is just to share the presentation with you. So what the presentation really covers my book, Peace in the Age of Chaos. And the book itself has a number of different themes within it. So the first one's a personal journey. So I'll share somewhat of my personal journey to where I've actually ended up now. The next part is like, I think this book in many ways is really important because it does provide a different way of being able to look at how we go about developing our societies. It also has the entrepreneurial story of developing a top-ranked international think tank as well. Because a lot of the time, I think people see entrepreneurial stories as something as with great strategy and vision, but a lot of the time there's something which unfolds. So the book covers that, and I think in many ways a lot of people find that interesting. Also, the concept positive peace. What are the factors which actually create the highly peaceful societies? And also brings in this concept of systems. And I think the concept of combining positive peace and systems is a way of looking at revitalizing our Western democracies, as well as sort of building resilience into some of the more troubled places of the world. I think it's an important concept. And finally, a little bit on positive peace and why that's a transformational concept. So without anything to do, I'll sort of launch into the presentation. So I'll start, look a little bit with my personal journey. And what I'm going to do is just go back in time. Because sort of, we look at my life, I started out as an IT entrepreneur, developed two companies. The first one ended up publicly listed on NASDAQ, and the second publicly listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. So made quite a bit of money out of that. Then established a family foundation, which worked with the poorest of the poor. And so what that did, it took me into a lot of war zones and near post-war zones. And a lot of the experiences there really shaped me. So I've established that probably, 22 years ago now, maybe 23. And since then, the foundation's done 220 different projects in different parts of the world. And the direct beneficiaries, not the indirect, but the direct beneficiaries from that now are about 3.8 million people. So it's been really quite a substantial and really very, very rewarding effort. So one of the earlier projects we did, and one of the things which shaped a lot of my thinking on peace, was working up in northern Uganda on the rehabilitation of the child soldiers which are captured by the LRA. Even today, and all the time I've been working in this area, I've never come across anything as bad as the Lord's Resistance Army. And at the height of the war against them by the Ugandan government, 2 million people from the Acholi tribe were living in concentration, or were living in refugee camps. And this is sort of flying over one of them, going into, I think, Lira up in northern Uganda. This was one of them. So in each of those huts, you've got about 6 people living. But the project we worked on the rehabilitation of child soldiers. And here's a photo of a child. Now, we don't know the name of the child. We don't know how old the child is, nor do we know the mother of the child or any of its family. And that because the mother was carrying the child on her back when she got caught in the firefight with the Ugandan army. And in the battle to get away, she dropped the child on the battlefield, and that then came in and sort of ended up in the camp with which we were rehabilitating the kids. And so some of these things here are some of them, and I haven't got time to go through it, but some of the most horrific things I've seen in my life. Like they generally capture kids aged 7 to 10, and the quite often murder 25% of them before they got back to their camp. So any kids which cried, were slow moving, they then get the other kids to beat them to death. And to force these kids to beat them to death, the soldiers stand over beating those kids. So horrific, just horrific stuff. Did work out in Tanzania. This is a shot from the Semi-nomadic Masal. We provided, this would have been about 20,000 people with the fresh water, and that was pumped down into from off Mount Meru, and rehabilitating a whole lot of wells and pipes which had been built by the British when they were there. And sort of this was quite amazing. You should go out into the middle of these areas and there's nothing, but suddenly you see these kids come over the horizon with some cans, get some water and move on, or some cattle come through, get some water, then move on. And that was tremendous. So another one was from Myanmar. This is one of my favourites. There was an entrepreneurial monk there we worked with who provided free education for 10,000 kids. Still support him and love him. But at one point there's a lot of fighting going up in Shan State. So a friend approached him and said, look, we've got all these kids up there. They've got no education. And once they get to a certain age, they either get pressed into the Shan civil militia or get pressed into the army. Can you do anything? So he said, well, you can give them education. We've got this accommodation, and you can see it right in the background there where the kids can stay. And they'd sleep 20 of them to a room, things like that. But he didn't have enough money to provide them food. So he took them all in, the 200 kids, as novice monks, because then in Myanmar, they could go out with a begging bowl and get their food each morning. So just great story of entrepreneurship to look after the hardship. This shot here was taken on the border of Burundi and the DRC. I've been driving for about half an hour in a car, hadn't seen a village, and suddenly I saw this guy pushing these bags up a hill on a bicycle. And I just realised then how difficult it was just in these places to just get simple produce to market. So this guy must have been going for 4 hours, 5 hours to get his bags of rice to market. And another one out of the DRC, and this one always haunted me. So if you look at the thing hanging down on the boy's chest there, that's a hernia. It comes out of the stomach. It comes out of the stomach because the muscles are so weak. Now, we did a project there working on the child survival project, and sort of involved a whole lot of changing the agricultural mix and things like that. We spent $5 million on that. No, I think it was 10, it was more. It was $10 to $20 million on that over a period of 5 years. And at the end, we could see no substantial difference. We wanted to get these kids with the hernias sewed back up and put in their stomach. But they said, well, there's no point in doing that because the nutrition's so bad, they'll just break out again. And I guess that was one of the things, I guess for Sabina had recognised that, which really hit me. Since then, I've sort of come to realise in Africa, probably the malnutrition or the undernutrition rate for boys is probably 50% higher in Africa than it is for girls. And that's simply because girls have got access to the food because they cook. And this is another one out of the Samburu in Kenya. We worked with some tribes up there to cure trachoma, which is an eye infection which you can get with the eyelids turn back in on the eye and scratch the eye until they go blind. So these are nomadic tribes that we're working with up there. Right, okay. So in many ways, sort of, I look at an entrepreneurial story and it really springs out of our lives. So my background's in IT, I've set up a number of different, 2 different global IT companies, which I've mentioned. But it wasn't until many, many years I was into IEP that I really realised just how much my background had shaped me. So coming out of an IT, we develop products, okay? The idea is to get a product to market in a fairly short period of time because you've got to beat the competition. And then what you do from there then is you incrementally improve it over time. Also, sort of marketing. If you can't get it out there, you can't get people to know about it, you can't sell. The other thing is how can you communicate your story or your product or your story in ways that everyone can understand. So it's how do you bring it down to simple and clear messages. And so I never realised any of that till I was well inside the process. So when we look at it, it started off with a question. So I was in northeast Kivu in the Congo and I wondered, what are the most peaceful nations in the world? Was there anything I could learn from them? And it was a bit of a fantasy question. Searched the internet, couldn't find a ranking of the nations of the world by their peacefulness. And that's how the Global Peace Index was born. So I had a mate who used to run the Economist Intelligence Unit in London. So I approached him. He says, oh, why don't you go over to them? They can develop an index for you. So I did that, sort of worked out the methodology. at a high level for what I wanted with the index, the philosophy behind it. And then they went away and sort of developed it. But got towards the end of it and I thought, well, it's not much point in just developing an index. I should do some PR around it. So I went and hired a PR company. And so then we did a global launch on it. And the global launch was phenomenally successful. Ended up on CNN, BBC, Fox News. And for me, it was a new experience. I'd never spoken on the media like that before. But I realized that there was a message there which other people wanted. So then what I did was decided I'd launch this every year. And then each year we'd incrementally improve it. But the more I studied peace, the more I realized we didn't know a lot about peace. Sort of quite often when we're studying peace, we're actually studying conflict. We're not studying peace. But there was a profound message in this, because if a simple businessman like myself can be walking through Africa and wonder what are the most peaceful nations in the world, then what do we know about peace? If you can't measure something, can you truly understand it? If you can't measure it, how do you even know whether your interventions are either helping or impacting the goals you're trying to achieve? You simply don't. And then as I looked further on into this, I just realized that peace and conflict, when we're talking peace, we're generally studying conflict. And what actually creates sustainable peace, I realized, was very, very different. And the best way is an analogy with health. Great breakthrough since the 50s in studying pathology. Probably no one here is going to die of a heart attack, yeah? And we look at cancers, really curing them. So the study of pathology is really, really, really important. But it wasn't until we got further on and we started to study healthy people did we realize what it took to stay healthy. Good exercise, correct mental disposition, good eating. So what I realized was that what it takes to stay healthy is very, very different than what it takes to actually understand pathology and fix disease. So you're never going to learn all those things through studying someone who's on their deathbed. And so that then put me on a journey then to try and really understand the positive aspects of peace. And that's where I came across the concept of positive peace, which to me was incredibly important. So as we started to build the products out, we built marketing out. And so today, our year runs to the 30th of June, but in this financial year, we'll get 25 billion media impressions globally. We'll get about 1 billion social media impressions as well. So now that story I could take and move on in all sorts of different ways. It's a very long story, but it's within the book. But I might just share, moving on, just one simple thing, one of my learnings out of life, which I think is incredibly important. So what I'd encourage anyone who's young on this call to, when you're looking at your future and what to do, focus on the things you really like to do. Because generally the things we really like to do, the things we're really good at. If we like to do things, we're picking doing something we're good at, we'll put a lot more energy in it to other people. And that creates a virtuous cycle. Then at some point, we'll realize we're really good. But it's a much later point where other people will see that success. And then once they see that success, later on, the actual money and recognition really flows. But I watch a lot of people in business, I'm sure it's the same in academia. What they're looking for is the money. So they'll chase wherever's hot to try and make the money. That's because so that other people will then see them as being good and give them status, and then they'll feel good about themselves. But my whole lesson in life, success, is based on exactly the opposite. Now, within the book, there's a lot on the state of the world. So the first thing I'll move into is the concept of rising inequality and peace. So we talk about rising inequality in other things. So this just gives you an idea. So if we look over time and over the 12 years covered here, what we find is that the most peaceful countries in the world have got more peaceful, whereas the least peaceful countries have become a lot less peaceful. So we're seeing over time this growing inequality and peace. I haven't got an explanation for it, but it's definitely there. Now, this is just a quick snapshot of just a few different things. So now, if we're looking at battlefield deaths, they've been falling since 2014. And so that was the peak of the war against ISIS. And so that's great. So if we look at this, they're sort of fallen by almost a bit over by 40%. But if we look now at the number of conflicts globally, they've actually increased. And if we look at the intensity of those low-level conflicts going forward, they've also increased. So in the background, we've got this rising level of tension there, which at some point will probably spill over unless we can reverse those trends. But I see very, very little emphasis on this kind of things. Now, this is one of the things I find really quite profound. It's the level of civil unrest. So I've picked on the negatives in this part of the presentation, because I think they're just worth focusing on. So if we're looking at things like general strikes, riots, non-violent demonstrations, all of them have risen quite remarkably in the last decade. This goes up to the end of 2019. It doesn't take COVID in. But what you can see, there's a number of issues within many of the countries in the world where citizens are less satisfied and are more likely to want to take action to try and change the system. And I think when we come out the back of the COVID-19, I think all this is going to get turbocharged. The underlying drivers for this haven't changed. So if we look at some of those things, they're things like group grievances, quality of information, fractionalized elites, political democracy, freedom of the press, and equitable distribution of the resources. So these are all things which come out of the measures of positive peace. But these ones which I think are of particular concern, we'd call these attitudes. So if we look at positive peace, it's made up of attitudes, institutions, and structures. So these trends are really worrying. But now if we come down and we sort of look at the ecological threats, we've been doing work on that lately. We looked at two areas, resource risks, that's water, food, population. What we found is the countries with very, very low resilience and facing very, very big shocks, we've got 740 million people living there. Then we also looked at natural disasters, floods, cyclones, droughts, temperature rises, etc. Another 1 billion there. And so as we look into this, consisted of 43 countries, dropped the duplicates, and then we found that there were 32 countries with 1.2 billion people at risk of being displaced by 2050. You can calculate this many ways, but we've just looked at the countries with the biggest likely shocks, and then also the countries with the lowest resilience. So just quickly now, we'll just have a look at some of them. And so all these countries you'll recognize, and so there's this relationship between resource scarcity and conflict. So the resources impact, so there's resources, you get conflict, okay? That conflict degrades the resources on it goes. So look at just some of these countries on this list: Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Chad, which we're watching what's happening there in the last few days, Eritrea, Haiti, Ethiopia, Liberia, Syria. So as you can see, then as we start to look at it, some of them have got moderate improvement in their positive peace, and that may work going forward, that they may come through, but others are deteriorating of very, very low levels. And these are the future basket cases and conflict traps of the world. Similar sort of thing you can see with natural disasters. Again, you'll come down here, Afghanistan again, Chad, Ethiopia, Iran, and on we keep on going. Now, one of the things which I think is the really, really important here is just the ability for us to be able to focus on the countries which really need attention. If we looked at the 10 countries which get the most overseas developmental aid, only 2 of them are on this list of the 34 countries. I'm going to come back, I'm moving really fast through this. I'm going to come now and talk a little bit about positive peace. So positive peace, the attitude, institutions and structures which create and sustain peaceful societies. Since we've got the Global Peace Index, which is the world's leading measure of the global peacefulness, we did statistical analysis to understand what are the factors most closely associated with highly peaceful society. So we use statistics and a number of different mathematical modelling techniques. So we've got about 50,000 different data sets now down in Sydney, and about 25,000 of them we've used in this analysis, maybe a bit less, maybe 15 to 20,000 at least. And so what we do then is that gives us the ability then to understand those factors. We now take more statistical techniques to clump them together, and that's how we end up with these 8 pillars. Now, these 8 pillars give us a view into a system, and that's turned out to be a highly effective way of being able to view societal systems. What we do is sort of then produce what's termed a positive peace index, because the importance of that now is we can start to see the movement of countries with these kind of structures. And sort of this moves them into virtuous or vicious cycles. So systems are self-propelling and they're generally moving in a direction. So when the direction is such that it's improving, we call that a virtuous cycle. When the system's degrading down, we call that a vicious cycle. But now having that, we could now take positive peace and compare it back to a whole lot of other things which we might think are important. And so we started with peace. It could have been possible to start somewhere else, but what we've done is end up describing a structure, if you like, which describes an optimal environment for human potential to flourish. So when we look at the statistical relationships with positive peace, we find there's higher per capita income. For example, if we go back 60 years, the countries at the top of the Global Peace Index compared to the bottom have 3 times higher GDP growth rate. But if we look at positive peace, when we look at countries which are improving in positive peace compared to countries which are deteriorating over a 12-year period, had 7 times higher GDP growth rates. So we can see this is the same environment for business to function. Great measures of resilience. So we can take models we've got now comparing positive peace to actual peace through the Global Peace Index. We go back a decade to 2020, we can take a group of countries and we can get a 70% to 90% accuracy rate on high levels of falls in peace. And what's the beautiful thing about the model is the smaller the number of countries in the model, the higher the accuracy rate. So this gives a mechanism now to really, truly understand where the biggest stresses are likely to be in the future. Also, countries high in positive peace have better environmental outcomes. They have better measures of well-being and have better performance on developmental factors as well. So therefore, positive peace can describe an optimal environment for human potential to flourish. Now, just to give you an idea of it, this is the world's view of the 8 pillars we've just seen above. Now, most of them have been improving, but as mentioned, we've got attitude, institutions, and structures. So structures are highly related to peace statistically, but there are also things which just keep on improving, like things which are related to per capita income, health outcomes, for example, educational outcomes. They just keep increasing. The attitudes are the things which are dropping. Now, if we look at this, you'll find the 2 at the bottom, low levels of corruption have deteriorated in the decade which this was done. And we'll find that well-functioning government has only just improved in the majority of countries. So now we'll go a bit deeper and look at some of the indicators which create the positive peace index. This is for Europe. So you'll note equality of information, the equitable distribution of resources, exclusion of socio-economic groups, freedom of the press, political democracy, group grievances were all on the rise. And so that's worse than the overall world's results. And this starts to point to some of the issues in the Western democracies. Now, if we come down to the United States, where most of you are living, it gets even worse. So these are the changes there. So fractionalized elites, that's really where the elites within the society start fighting. And so you can see that being played out quite remarkably across the political landscape in the US. You can see the group grievances on the rise. You can obviously, we can all see the quality of information falling off. So unless we address these things, Western democracies are in decline. So I haven't got a watch with me. How long have I been talking now? Can someone tell me? Right, okay.
It's been so interesting. I don't think we have been keeping track.
Okay, so probably got 10 minutes to go. Will I keep going or do you want me to wrap up soon? Just
Sure,
keep
that
going,
sounds great.
I suppose. Okay, let's now move into systems and how they operate. Okay, system, this is a profoundly different concept. So what I'm going to do is just start about empiric science. And so if we think about empiricism, great strides, like the advances which have come in the last 500 years in the scientific age have been phenomenal. But empiricism's based around the study of physics and physical objects. And so it's based on cause and effect. And so firstly, you have a cause, it has effect, and the effect doesn't have an influence on the cause. So that means I can throw a ball into the air, catch, and it'll always be the same. So this concept of cause and effect, it's been phenomenally successful in study. Now, what happens also when we start to look at this, what we see is things have built up, and you can take things and break them down into smaller and smaller pieces. And that way you've got the ability to be able to understand them. And so it means you can destruct something, build it back up, and it'll always be the sum of its parts. Now, cause and effect is built deeply into all our subconscious. So one's just the example of the ball, but we actually can walk down the street because of the physics of our legs. We understand at a very deep level how they operate. Each time we walk, it'll be pretty much the same. And that's cause and effect. However, systems operate off very, very different principles. So what happens with a system is you have these mutual feedback loops. So the effect actually influences the cause. Also, the system is much more the sum of its parts. So what I want you to do is just think about your own consciousness. You are much more than the sum of your parts. And thereby, by extension, we look at societal systems, collections of individuals, they're more than the sum of their parts. But to just give you an idea of how empiricism is just so deeply embedded within our systems and the way that governments operate and think. Look at a university, okay? Universities we can find are built around empiricism. So you started off and you look at the history of education, you had a number of disciplines, and then those disciplines got broken down into smaller chunks, and then you'd get specialisation and more specialisation. And the concept of really doing a PhD is quite often a very small area of specialisation. But if we're now starting to look at the challenges which are facing humanity today, they're global in nature, like climate change, ever-decreasing biodiversity, full use of the fresh water on the planet. They're all systemic. But also, more importantly, unless we have a world which is basically peaceful, we'll never get the levels of trust, cooperation, or inclusiveness necessary to solve these problems. Therefore, peace is a prerequisite for the survival of society as we know it in the 21st century. That's different than any other epoch in the human history. In the past, it may have been the domain of the altruistic, but in the 21st century, it's literally in everyone's self-interest. And systems are built in right at the basis of us trying to understand a future which is becoming more and more complex all the time. So in causal thinking, we think about events. Here's an event. What was the cause? Let's knock out the cause, then we won't have the event. Systems aren't about events. They're the byproduct of the relationships and flows. If we think about the election of President Trump, we can see from those figures earlier on, that's a byproduct of a system, the relationships and flows. Now, just to really drive this home, think of three of the pillars out of positive peace: low levels of corruption, free flow of information, well-functioning government. Does well-functioning government affect corruption and the functioning of the press? Or does the press affect how the government operates and the tolerance for corruption in society? Or does corruption affect the well-functioning government and work on the flow of information. As you can see, they all mutually interact together. So therefore, you need frameworks where you can focus on all the different things within it. So just a few properties now of the systems. They're self-regulating and seek homeostasis. They're path dependent, okay? We're a bit like us in our biology. We're on a particular path. Look at your careers. Your career is determined by the path which has come before it. Societies are the same. So if you want to change them, you want to have multiple nudges, many nudges, moving it in the direction you want to go. It reduces risk and also means that you're likely to be stimulating more in all of the system. You can use positive peace and the 8 pillars as the lenses with which to view systems. Encoded norms regulate the system. So an encoded norm is you get an input, the input's within the norm measures, nothing happens. If it's outside it, then it tries to create an intervention to go back and change the input. That's a mutual feedback loop, which is very different than what you get with cause and effect. Think of the society today. You've got COVID-19. You can see that it's an abnormal input. It's outside the encoded norms. So countries struggle to try and regulate it, bring it back under control. Think of an outbreak in crime, more police are applied, and so on. We can see it in all sorts of different ways. So they're also systems of self-modifying, with a persistent mismatch with the inputs. It tries to modify the encoded norms now to either change that input or adjust to it. And things, as I mentioned, move in virtuous or vicious cycles. These systems are self-regulating. And this is the homeostasis, if you like. Once you've got a homeostasis, it's moving the system in a particular direction. And this is really important. Systems can be understood through mathematics. Most of the stuff I see, particularly in peace and conflicts, is people's thinkings of way a system operates. So you see all these spaghetti diagram maps, and it's really just what people think rather than it's been based off maths. So I think we're finally finishing up now. Just a few things. So could this give you an idea of the difference in the GDP growth rates going back 60 years when you look at peace and per capita income? We go back and we start to look at civil resistance movements in countries which are high in positive peace, less civil resistance movements. They last for a shorter amount of time, more moderate in their aims, more likely to meet their aims, and are far less violence. And that comes back to a system, its resilience, and the resilience comes from its ability to adapt, the adaptability of the system. So positive peace, as you can see, it's a transformational concept. Change happens systemically. Systems are on paths. Their trajectory really needs to be understood before we try and mess too much with change. Best way to move a system is to nudge it, many different nudges from many different directions. And positive peace provides a lens from which you can view systems and determine holistic change. So now we look at it. As I mentioned earlier on, humanity's major challenges are global in nature. Unless we have a world which is basically peaceful, we'll never develop the trust, cooperation, and inclusiveness to solve these problems. Therefore, peace is a prerequisite for the survival of society as we know it in the 21st century. And that, my friends, is the end of the presentation. Sorry I've gone a bit long, but I haven't got a watch with me, and when the screen takes over, I lose the timer on the bottom of the screen.
Steve, we lost time with you. Your talk was riveting, arising from a commitment to study the human pain that we've all seen, but few know how to tackle. And you applied a razor-like curiosity to understand and to prevent it. And your approach of positive peace seems so intuitive when you say it. But what you've also shown is it's built on massive quantitative analysis, cutting-edge systems theory, but also an awareness of the policy aptitudes that real institutions can manage to bring to bear. So thank you so much. We now turn to our commentators, beginning with Pedro Conceição. Pedro, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Sabina. Steve, that was wonderful. It was a real joy to read your book. And as Sabina said, it was riveting to listen to you. I know that Matt wants to invite you to go back to Georgetown, and I want to invite you also to come to the UN to share your wonderful presentation. And again,
Actually, George Washington. I'll have to put that in there, Pedro. Sorry for cutting you off.
sorry.
George Washington University.
What did I say?
That other George is the King George. We're the Patriot George. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. In fact, Steve, I don't know if you remember, but the first time I met you was sometime last year when we were doing the Human Development Report, the 2020 Human Development Report. And I have to be honest, I didn't know who you were. I mean, I knew that you were the head of IEP. I had had interactions with IEP, but in my mind, as the head of IEP, you were, you know, an academic, an intellectual, a scholar, and that was the assumption under which I had the first conversation with you, and that's how you came across. So my biases or my assumptions were reinforced by the conversation I had with you. In fact, you had just come out from a workout. It was early morning in Australia, so I don't know if you just came out from a workout this morning also. That was also the context in which I met you a second time this year with a group of colleagues to try to understand better, particularly the work that we do around the Ecological Threat Index, which was very important for us in the context of the Human Development Report. But then it was my colleague John Hall, which I believe is joining us, who is from Australia, that told me who you really were. And I want to come back to this personal, your personal journey, because you mentioned it in the book and you told us a little bit about it in your presentation at the end of my comments, if I could. But first, I wanted to share a couple of reflections on the similarities that I see between your work, Steve, and the human development approach and concept in a way. So first of all, I think that if we think of tactics, the way in which you tried to have media pay attention to the concept of peace, when media is usually attracted to covering conflict, wars, violence, I think was brilliant. So media reacts, we know, to novelty. They have to tell a story about something. So by putting forward an index that ranks countries, that is something that is able to generate media interest and attention from policymakers. And in a way, that was also the strategy behind the Human Development Index. Amartya Sen, in our latest Human Development Report, has a short text about the origins of the Human Development Index, and that was very much the same strategy or tactic, I should say, putting out an index that would rank countries and generate interest from media and debate. And this is a strategy that's actually been used many times by many people to propose many indices, and it's quite successful. But I think that another similarity between your work, Steve, and the human development approach is that there is something more behind the index. And this is something that you not always see in some of the proposals that are put out there, in which countries are ranked by all sorts of metrics. So the Global Peace Index, as your presentation showed and your book illustrates very clearly, is really a window into a vast world of thinking around this concept of peace. And I think that there's actually a number of similarities, even though we use different language and different words and different terms between the human development approach and the thinking, this conceptual approach to peace that you put forward. For instance, there is a focus, you mentioned it once in your presentation, but in the book quite frequently, this idea of flourishing people flourishing as the aspiration. So very much along the lines of the human development approach, we are less interested in material well-being or even self-reported measures of happiness. Also, the emphasis that you put on, but you've used human development language, this notion that people have agency. You say in your book that humans are not passive, that they are active, that they are always adjusting their intentions and behavior. And then, and you handed the presentation with this point, and this is very much aligned with our 2020 Human Development Report, making very much explicit how our social and economic systems are embedded in natural systems, and also the step changes that are taking place as we go deeper into the reality that many people speak as the Anthropocene, that poses a new set of risks and threats that may be reflected in some of the data that you showed. Finally, let me conclude with some reflections on this notion of positive peace, because as I was reflecting about positive peace, I think that is very much aligned also with an important idea around the human development approach. The concept was popularized by Johan Galtung, the concept of positive peace in the 1960s, when he described negative peace as the absence of personal violence and positive peace as the absence of structural violence. In his thinking, Galtung's thinking, violence is seen as the cause of something that provides a difference between what people actually achieve and what people could potentially achieve. And I think the contribution that you make, Steve, is by reframing these early notions of positive peace into something in which positive peace is something that can be interpreted as a state of affairs that narrows this difference between what people could achieve and are actually achieving. And so if we take this understanding and interpretation, it's easy to see the parallel with the human development approach, which is not concerned with the material resources or mental states, but is very much focused on this notion that's important to expand capabilities for people to do and be what they value and have reason to value. So I just wanted to signal that as I read your book and as I listened to you today, I saw a number of parallels and connections between what lies behind the Global Peace Index and the notions that inform the human development approach. Now let me turn to measurement, because when it comes to measurement, I think that we took somewhat different approaches, and that generated in me some ideas that I would or questions perhaps that I would like to pose to you. Well, first of all, both human development and positive peace are obviously concepts that are not easy to quantify and measure. Now, what I think is interesting is that in the human development approach, we took a different direction compared to what you did. So in the human development approach, we took a reasoning that led us to propose a number of indicators. So the Human Development Index, for instance, is premised on this idea that there is a set of basic capabilities related to living standards, to the ability of people to be healthy and are able to participate in social and economic life, that suggested indicators related to income, health, and education achievements. And the same logic then was used in gender indices and in our indicators. Now, as I understand it, your approach is different, and I can understand why, and you justify it, because the concept of positive peace can be bogged down, or can get bogged down into different values, social norms, cultural dimensions. And so you took an approach that is grounded on empirics. So you are agnostic in terms of what constitutes, as I understand it, positive peace, the different dimensions, and sort of let the data speak. And I think that is very powerful, original, and provides a number of new insights, as you suggested. But I would ask the question of whether in doing that, one can always be completely agnostic or neutral, because even in the interpretation of what emerges from the principal component analysis that you undertake, the tagging or the labeling of these variables embeds in it a judgment. And so I was wondering if you could, well, first of all, if you think this is valid, and whether there is scope to explore perhaps grounding your metrics, not as an alternative or not to replace what you did, but to ground it also in a reasoning similar to the one that we undertake when we construct our indices. And I will explain why this might matter when I conclude my comments. And a second important element here is, as you alluded to, social systems are ever changing. They are path dependent. And so I think it's important, yes, to let the data speak, but given that they are always changing, if we ground it always in empirics, we may be confronting a challenge that we may not be capturing how society is changing, because what we're trying to explain is driven by the data that we are using to construct our interpretation. So I want to conclude here, but as I said at the beginning, I want to come back to you, Steve, as a person, if I could. And I think this is legitimate because that's an important part of the story. And now I know who you are after John alerted me. And you are a very successful entrepreneur. Now I want to finish with this reflection. All societies have different aspirational values that evolve and change over time. So in classic antiquity, virtue was the most important value, and you allude to this also in your book. During the Renaissance, it was power that was the most important value. In many societies today, that aspirational value has to do with economic success, with money. And many people around the world turn economic success into successful political careers and in other fields. And this is often on the coattails of a narrative of personal accomplishment. What I found striking in what you wrote, Steve, is how generous you are. And I think that generosity gives a very powerful ethical force to your analysis and your proposals. First of all, because you acknowledge many people as we go through the book. I was struck at first that there was no acknowledgements. You know, usually books have a section of acknowledgements. Your book has no acknowledgement. Then I understood why, because every other page you acknowledge someone that meant something in your career and your life, and it helped you in many dimensions of your life. And you also say that many of the things that happened to you, not to underplay your talents and your effort, were due to luck. And I think this is something that is very refreshing, and it I think gives a lot of, as I said, ethical force to the appeal that you make at the end of the book of having positive peace as a rallying cry for the world that we're living in. So, thank you.
Thank you, Pedro, for drawing parallels to the Human Development Report, where the Global Peace Index, like the HCI, is a headline-grabbing ranking, but it reflects an underlying commitment to human flourishing in many dimensions, including and going beyond economic sphere and recognizing the environmental settings. And you also recognize that Steve's book goes beyond measurement to analysis that enlivens policy, but recognizing that that analysis carries an ethical force because of the personal commitment of the minds undertaking it. We now move to Matthew Levinger. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sabina, and Steve, thanks for your eloquent presentation, and Pedro for your very, very thoughtful remarks. You touched on a number of the themes that I want to address, and I know that we have a very brief amount of time and a lot of people who I'm sure are interested in getting involved in the conversation. So I'm going to try to keep my remarks pretty short here. First of all, just want to remark on the importance, as is a common theme, both in what Steve said and what Pedro has said, of the importance of measuring the things that you want to value. That we often that if we can't measure something, it's hard to work out a strategy to achieve it. And so the tremendous contribution of the Global Peace Index is to really give us a template for measuring peace along a number of different dimensions. And so I think it's tremendously valuable in that regard. And from my standpoint, teaching both conflict resolution courses at the graduate level and also teaching senior level executive education programs for military and civilian officials on national security, this really resonates with the themes that I address. Because when we're in the national security field, often a government will identify its objectives as being something like, counterterrorism or great power competition or democracy promotion or what have you. And these headlines don't necessarily translate that well to a very specific set of metrics for how you would know whether you're moving in the right direction or not. And often, as in the case, for example, of counterterrorism efforts, we see tactical metrics being established that may be counterproductive in terms of the overarching strategic objective. So tactically, killing more terrorists may be a good thing, but we know that strategically, the more terrorists that are killed, the more terrorists tend to rise up. And so I think that the 8 pillars of positive peace are a really excellent starting point for measuring the kinds of things that we need to be aiming to accomplish. And I guess what I would like to I want to abbreviate my remarks by focusing on one or two broad questions about these pillars. First of all, the nature of a systems analysis is that everything is interconnected, as Steve said. So a sound business environment is clearly closely related to low levels of corruption, or the free flow of information is important for well-functioning governments, and so forth and so on. But the nature of the GPI is that it adds up performance on each of these different pillars. And so I'm wondering, how do you translate that additive nature of the rankings in the Global Peace Index with the much more fluid and interactive nature of the connections among these various pillars? So that would be one sort of broad overarching question. And then I guess another question that I have has to do with your excellent point about how nudging the system is a more successful strategy in the long run rather than radical change. And so systems, as you say, tend to revert to homeostasis if you have a system that's not a peaceful system, and you want to move it have a state change into a more peaceful environment, you need to nudge it in the appropriate places. But how does your analysis give us a foundation for figuring out what the most critical places are in which to nudge? So for example, when you write about Afghanistan, you say that for conflict to stop, there need to be improvements in the domains of a well-functioning government combined with low levels of corruption and an equitable distribution of resources. I think that's all very true, but in some ways, I think that's similar to what the American and NATO strategy in Afghanistan was, that the US forces wanted to establish a well-functioning government, reduce corruption, and maybe they weren't as concerned about equitable distribution of resources. But obviously all three of those things turned out to be enormously challenging, and the US is about to leave Afghanistan after 20 years with its tail between its legs. And so in some sense, I guess my question to you is, how do you move from this high level analysis of the 8 pillars of positive peace to advice that you would give to military or development or diplomatic advisors working to try to make a positive difference in these environments? But thanks very much. It's really, really an honor to be on this panel.
Thank you, Matthew, for articulating the value of Steve's work in measuring and pursuing peace as the fundamental objective rather than tactical objectives, and for the questions both on measurement of interlinked phenomenon using an index, and also on how do you set priorities and sequences of policy. As we turn to Steve for his reflections on both Pedro and Matthew's questions, please do put your own questions in the chat, and we'll come back to those after Steve has responded. Steve, back to you.
Okay, thanks for your comments, Pedro. It's interesting just getting your reflections on me and the interactions with me here. I quite often get introduced as Dr. Killelea, and I guess it's just because what I do. Everyone must think I've got a PhD, but far from it.
I'm not sure I'm going to recommend your book to my son, though.
Why?
I don't think to be surfing until he's 25.
And Matthew, thanks for your comments too. I think that your ones, they're good. They're really quite practically grounded. So the first thing, yes, when you pick up a set of things like acceptance of the rights for others, okay, that's it's got a concept laden in to the very word. So in some ways, words can never be agnostic. In our documents when we're editing, but we try to be as agnostic as possible. And see, even back to the smallest of the adjectives or adverbs, just to try and keep the stuff as factual as possible. So acceptance for the rights of others, in many ways, that's sort of analogous to human rights, but we didn't use the words human rights because in a number of cultures or a number of countries, human rights is seen as being quite confrontational, particularly if you're trying to work with some of the more authoritarian governments. So acceptance of the rights of others seem to work. The framework itself, we've used it in every major culture now, and we haven't had any pushback on it. Occasionally, some people say, gee, there should be extra pillars like gender, or there should be an extra pillar on environment. But what we'd say is this is a description of a system, and those things sort of come out of the system. So what's really important is if you've got the environment, how does the system interact with the environment? And similarly, if you're looking at gender, what is the system which is most likely to encourage gender empowerment and things like that? Now, with the index, and it's true for both the global peace and particularly the positive peace index, the measures we use evolve over time. So every year to 2 years, we go back, we look at the underlying statistical correlations, better data comes up, different stages, things can start to change. Systems change very, very slowly. But what I would say, if we sort of look at it and draw analogies back to human beings, let's say, this is always a good one. There are certain factors about human beings which don't change, okay? And that gives us the way to be able to identify it as a human being. And if you like, those eight pillars, if you like, give the ability to be able to look at a social system from that angle. But when you get down inside it, it's really quite different. Now, the last point on aspirational values is that they're different within different societies. So built inside it, and I didn't cover it here because it's such a short presentation, as concept of intent. Human beings have intent. Societies, by extension of human beings, also have intent. And the intent will vary from society to society, and that intent combined with the encoded norms quite often determines the actions. Now, if we come back and we start to look at the concept of the nudging systems. So now, if a system's truly broken, bigger interventions can be made, but we can see quite often if you take a system and really break it, even bad systems like Syria, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, the outcomes are very, very difficult to perceive. And you're right on Afghanistan. So if we're looking at Afghanistan and the recommendations there, you can, in some ways, they're sort of simplistic, okay? If we really comment on that. But the question more is if you look at, let's say, American interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, for example, have they met? How were they actually implemented? And so if you look at a lot of it, there's a lot of it came back to self-interest. A lot of it came back to domestic political agendas around what will we do to stimulate the system. And I think sort of this the implementation of trying to build peace in Afghanistan and particularly Iraq was really flawed. Now, if we're coming down and we're taking positive peace and we're now trying to implement it, there's two ways you can look at implementing it. So first is at a community level, and we're doing projects in many different parts of the world on that. The others at a more a governmental level, let's say. So one of the things we do, we start with, let's say, those 8 pillars. We've got about 400 different measures we can take. Now we look at those measures and we look at how those measures have been changing over time. And that gives us an idea then at a much deeper level of the areas within a district or a state or a nation. It gives us an idea of the momentum, which ones are sort of best to focus on. So if you've got pillars which are, so if you've got the important indicators which are strong and improving, well, you probably don't have to do too much there. You've got important ones which are deteriorating, then you need to work out how do you approach it. And then sort of you look from that, and that gives you the ability to use situational intelligence or understand the unique path of the system to be able to start to work with. So that's the kind of analysis we've done. We've done a number of them, done a few of them for UNDP actually. Now, the other area, which gets right down to the grassroots, which I think gets at what Matthew was saying, we can take this framework and apply it in a community setting. And I've got some stunning examples. So we just finished training 800 people in Ethiopia on positive peace. So sort of go out and start to work on projects there. We've got about 3,000 ambassadors, IEPs, trained along these similar lines. So now if you're doing it, and we've got Rotary International who's standardized on positive peace to roll out through their network, and it's the largest social organization in the world, 1.3 million members. Now, with that, what you do is you get community, you get the community to look at making the decisions. So it's really important because the community itself will understand its part. It's built inside, and it means you're not now starting to parachute things come in out of values of other societies. So what you want them to do is 3 principles based around it. The first thing is you want to do something which is we'll say substantial, and I'll use a little s on substantial, not a big S. You want something which you can do within the current environment, okay? Because there's a lot of things you can come up with and you can think about, but the dynamics, the political dynamics or the social dynamics just won't allow you to do. The third thing is you want it done within a reasonable amount of time. You look at whatever your problem is, and this could be as simple as education in a school, okay? Be as simple, and I'll come back to that, simple as an education in a school. You come back to that, now you get the community, or the people who are actively engaged, you get a decent representation of it. And now they come up with what they think can be done with through each of those pillars. And that gives you a holistic way of being able to view the project. So we did some work in Libya at some stage, brought them into Tunisia, people from different cities, did a 5-day workshop on positive peace, looking at the issues. And so these cities in some ways were pretty much at war. And the individual said, well, look, we never thought we'd be sitting in the same room with these people, let alone agreeing with them. Because what we did, cause and effect, okay? You've got an effect. What was the cause? It's generally people involved, and you end up fighting over something in different values. But the positive piece, because you're looking at changing a system going forward, everyone's looking at what can we do going forward. So it's more about sort of how do we change the forward momentum rather than looking back into the past, and it creates a different dynamic. So I'll just finish up on this one little example. So this came out of Uganda. We had a guy we trained there some years ago on positive peace, and he was with one of the, I think, of the Sissi Islands Rotary Club in Uganda, and they were running an education project in one of the really poor schools in Uganda. They've been doing it for about 2 years and really hadn't shifted the education levels at all in the school. So he then went in and thought, oh, well, I'll go in and I'll engage and come in and use it from the positive peace framework. So for each of the pillars, he did something. So things like well-functioning government, he got involved, the local leaders in the area engaged, he got the principals of the school engaged. They did did a whole range of other things, improved it so under a equitable distribution, supplied pens and paper into the school because a lot of the kids couldn't even afford that. But the two things which came and really made a difference, none of the, you know, both, Pedro, we all know these two things. But the first one was under acceptance of the rights of others. A lot of the girls weren't coming to school because of menstruation 4 days. So they introduced pads, okay, sanitary pads into the school, made a difference. And okay, that increased the representation of the school and helped in the increase the marks. The thing which made the biggest difference is when they looked at good relationships with neighbours, because this was in a rural area. Kids at lunchtime were going out and raiding the fruit trees in the surrounding properties. And in these this place incredibly poor, these incredibly poor environments, every apple, every orange, people consider important. So what they did is they introduced a porridge feeding program at lunchtime. And as we know, this just cost a couple of cents a person. Now, they also, under a free flow of information, went to the local radio station and then broadcast what they were doing on the local radio station. Results of that is the attendance of the school went up 250%. What they found is what they had before implementing these changes, they had 20% of the 30% of the students in the top 2 academic levels for the district. At the back end, they had 60%, double the academic success rate. And a lot of it came down to the feeding program, because what happened now, more people sent their kids to school because they knew they were going to get fed, because the kids in this environment had to go out and sort of fend for themselves. The small amount of porridge at lunchtime meant that the brains didn't lag in the afternoon. They could stay more attentive, and that their scholastic performance. That's an example of right at a community level using it. But if you're going up to higher levels like government and that kind of stuff, we use that to approach looking at the various indicators under each of the pillars and see which pillars are higher, which indicators are improving, which ones aren't, then with a focus from it coming systemically. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Steve. That's really great. So we've opened it to questions, and the first is a request for information on the IEP Ambassador Program. Is undergraduate student participation encouraged?
Yeah, look, so that runs over 3 sessions. Runs over about 3 hours per session. There's a small online course you have to do first. That takes about 5 hours from memory. So, but if you go to we run two of these training sessions a year. So if you go to a website called Vision of Humanity, you'll be able to pick it up from there, or to the website Institute for Economics and Peace. Either of them, you'll be able to get it. So it's an IEP ambassador. It's an IEP ambassador course.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Steve. So the next, a highly distinctive aspect of your work has been the acknowledgement of how the business community can throw their weight around to destabilize systems or to invest in positive peace. Of course, this is a huge topic, but could you fill it out, just a couple observations on whether in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, the private sector might contribute positively in ways that previous interactions may have not?
Look, I think there's a huge relationship between prosperity, peace, and the social order. It's a lot of the time, particularly working in the areas of peace, a lot of people don't get business. They're looking at the areas where business cause problems. Okay, so they look at environmental issues. They'll look at mining. They might look at graft and corruption, military-industrial complex, things like that. But for me, coming from a business background, I think overall business is really, really, really a positive. The more you can stimulate competitive business environments, the more you're likely to be able to increase the levels of peace. And so after doing the ecological threat register, one of the things which really could see was you've got real issues going forward around food and really sort of and water, and food in many ways is a byproduct of water. And so, as I mentioned earlier on, we've done 220 different projects out of my family foundation now around the world. And one of them we do is working on sand dams, and we put them in, and then they cost 25 to 50,000 to build, and they last 50 to 100 years. And then you've just put a pump in, you pump the water out. It's below ground, so you don't get much evaporation at all. Water's clean, but you can't get animals in to foul it, and it's incredibly cheap way. But I'm watching all the projects we're doing, and I'm watching the people. Then they create crops around it. Okay, and up to 40 hectares. They're agriculture. They've got agriculture coming out of the water captured in these sand dams. But no one's ever, because it's coming out of developmental areas, it's ever put a business case around doing it. And so I look, particularly in the Sahel, and I look in the Horn of Africa, and you've got 17 countries in that region. We're going to more than double their population in the next 30 years. And so if you can create the concept of micro water businesses, you have got the ability then to be able to really possibly re-stimulate these areas. But when quite often, if you're coming from the World Bank or someone like that, they'll think of big dams, which is massive, large-scale irrigation. That's fine for very big farmers. But in these areas, most people have got lucky to have an acre of land. And so so these sand dams, I can see as providing a mechanism to be able to, for locals, to be able to build businesses around it where they capture the water, work with the locals, produce produce, get a portion of the produce back for building the dams, and you've got a business cycle there. So for me, we need a lot more emphasis on sort of the how can we actually use business to solve a lot of these problems. So one of them just came out of Victoria in Australia last week, which I thought was brilliant. So you got a beer company down there called Victoria Bitter. They did a deal with one of the energy companies so that people, if they put a solar power of their houses into the grid, the beer company would then buy the power off the electricity company. Now, in exchange for every $30 of power they give the customers $50 worth of beer. And so it's a win-win situation. And so what happens is for the company like this, they've got wholesale prices on it. They're probably making more margin, giving the beer at a discount to the customers. And it's encouraging people now to flow back into the grid. If you come around in Australia, coal's a big thing, okay? Big thing. And it's even more so than what you'll see in the US. And so what we're finding with the ESG now, because of we've got very good superannuation schemes or pension schemes here in Australia. Everyone contributes 12% of their wages to superannuation. So this is a huge amount of money flowing into the stock markets. So most of we're finding a lot of the energy companies now, their share prices dropping because they're coal dependent and because the pension funds won't invest because of ESG in what they see as unethical. So this now is having a dynamic on the energy companies to make them start to think more green. So these are just a couple of examples of the benefit of business. And I think we really sort of need to sort of better understand it. If we look within society, all money actually is really generated pretty much out of business. And that then goes in taxes to governments, and that money then flows on. So business is in many ways is that economic wealth creation. And there's this massive virtuous cycle between peace or economic development and business. And yeah, anyway, that's a few musings.
Thank you so much, Steve. And to the business community, the invitation is open. This has been a tremendously stimulating and thoughtful exchange between Steve with experts from economic development and from conflict prevention on Steve Killelea's newly launched book, Peace in the Age of Chaos, the Best Solution for a Sustainable Future. I hope that you, our audience, feel that your own work has been enriched and encouraged. And I ask us perhaps each to crystallize our intent, as Steve mentioned, and then also to share this video, which will be archived online with others who will find Steve's work and book to enrich their own. But thank you so much, Steve, for this interaction. And we look forward to ongoing discussions and interactions with the Ambassadors Program and with your work as it rolls out in the business, policy, and development sectors. Thank you so much.